"The police can't keep acting like this." The officer pulled the black woman out of the car, tied her to a tree, and without hesitation, he said to her, "Who do you think you are? People like you don't have the right to speak." But she didn't stay silent. Her cold, sharp gaze made him tremble. As she replied, "You don't know who I am, but you will soon." That quiet neighborhood in the late afternoon was left with nothing but long, empty streets, faint light flickering from old street lamps glinting off worn-out signs, evoking a sense of dullness and cold. Under the cover of darkness, Officer Darren Matthews drove his patrol car slowly, his eyes sharp, filled with suspicion toward everything around him. Even after serving in the police force for more than 20 years, he still held deep-rooted prejudice against black people, especially those who appeared in these desolate areas. When his gaze settled, unsurprisingly, there stood Angela Lewis, a black woman, near an abandoned house, a place no one with a clear reason would choose as a stop. She stood tall, hands in her pockets, nothing strange about her except for the loneliness that enveloped the space. But to Officer Matthews, it might have been a threat. A black woman standing in the middle of this silent neighborhood, facing an abandoned house. All of it signaled to him suspicion something was not right. He slowed the car, stopped for a few seconds, before rolling down the window and shouted at her, "Who do you think you are standing here with no reason?" The question was not a greeting but an accusation. Angela didn't rush to react. She stood still, firm in her stance, showing no sign of fear. Her eyes were sharp, full of resolve, as if she had been through situations like this too many times. Though she might have been boiling inside, she gave nothing away. She looked at the officer calmly and replied, her voice steady but strong, "I'm standing here because I want to, not because you want me to." The cold reply made Officer Matthews feel challenged. This was not the attitude of someone willing to submit to his authority. In Matthews' eyes, this was unforgivable. He cursed under his breath, his voice tightening. "Are you going to shut your mouth, or do I need to teach you how to stay quiet?" Unable to tolerate her attitude, Matthews began to get aggressive. He stepped out of the car, walked toward Angela, and ordered her to cooperate. She didn't move, showed no panic. That only made Matthews angrier. With no other way, he decided to act, tying her to a large tree nearby to assert his authority. He grabbed some ropes from the car and bound her hands tightly to the trunk. Matthews' actions weren't about safety or duty. They were about control and domination. The heat of tension filled the air, but Angela didn't flinch. She stood tall, her eyes locked on the officer's face. She looked at him as if she'd seen this injustice too many times. "What are you doing?" Angela asked, but there was no fear in her voice. She continued, her sharp gaze like it could pierce the arrogance in the officer's eyes. "You don't know who I am?" Angela's words cut into Matthew's arrogance like a blade, a defiant stare, and instantly the young officer Tommy, standing silently nearby and visibly hesitant, was tempted to join the violent act. This young officer, new to the force, was looking for a chance to prove himself. Without much thought, he stepped forward and began helping Matthews tie her hands tightly to the tree, glaring at Angela. He seemed unable to wait for another moment to feel power in his hands. Part of Tommy felt he had to participate. Though he had never believed hurting someone like this was right, the pride in his role led him to follow through without thinking. Angela didn't groan or resist, but she clearly felt the cost of being treated like a person without worth. She looked at Tommy and scoffed while he spoke softly, as if trying to ease the moment. "Don't make this harder on yourself, just keep quiet." Tommy's voice was gentle, but it offered Angela no comfort, only temporary reassurance for himself. Angela didn't care about Tommy's words. She knew this was the system trying to crush her. She sighed, then coldly replied, "You think I'll stay quiet? Don't count on it." Her coldness only made the older officer, Matthews, angrier. He had run out of patience. The police didn't wait long. He demanded that Angela be silent immediately, but she remained still, staring at him without fear, as if speaking a truth he didn't want to hear. When Angela asked to speak with Matthew's superior, she received no reply, only silence, and the officer's growing defiance. Matthews grew more furious and yanked her arm tighter against the tree without mercy. "Do you really think I'm a criminal?" Angela said, her voice calm but laced with clear anger, shaking Matthews' control. This was no longer just a confrontation between an officer and an oppressed woman. It was a battle between power and resistance, between what the system tried to impose and what this person, whoever she might be, refused to accept. A passerby happened to witness the scene under the dim glow of a streetlight. He had no idea his gaze would accidentally become part of a larger event, pushing the story beyond that small neighborhood and into the view of millions. He stopped, pulled out his phone, and started recording. He didn't fully grasp the nature of what was happening. He simply saw an officer violently tying a black woman to a tree, his contempt clear in both his expression and action. The woman stood there, enduring the abuse without a scream. She wasn't a panicked victim, but a woman full of resilience, her eyes challenging the system even as she was restrained. He kept filming without much thought, simply wanting to capture the moment. The seconds of violence continued on his phone screen, but no one knew that this moment would ignite a wave of outrage and unimaginable change. The video began to spread. Watching it through the screen, he saw the situation more clearly, and a thought flashed through his mind. "What are the police doing? This is definitely racism," he wrote in a short caption before sharing the video online. Not long after, the video quickly went viral across social media platforms, spreading at lightning speed. In less than a few hours, people who had never heard of Angela began to speak out. Discussions erupted with unstoppable fury. Hashtags like "Justice for Angela" and "Police Brutality" started to trend, and everyone was talking about what they had just witnessed. The online community, especially those following anti-racist groups, began to apply growing pressure for an investigation into the incident. Comments, shares, and criticisms flooded every corner of the internet. One of the most striking comments came from a viewer of the video. "If she were white, would this have happened?" The question hit a nerve, calling out the racial bias deeply rooted in society and fueling the community's anger. Social media users were no longer just reacting to the officer's actions, but confronting the hidden injustices of the legal system and police conduct. The online community didn't stop at outrage. Anti-racism organizations quickly launched a campaign demanding a full investigation. Social groups and activists, from influencers to everyday individuals, joined in, sharing the video and calling for justice for Angela. Comments like, "This is open racism, we can't let it slide, we can't let it slide," began to appear constantly, generating a powerful wave of online outrage. The community was no longer just watching the video, they were feeling the injustice that had happened to this woman. The feeling of outrage and injustice spread beyond social media. Discussions grew intense as people flocked to virtual protests, posts, and discussion groups, pushing harder for justice. Direct criticism of Officer Matthews became more frequent. Those who had witnessed the incident and those who watched the video began demanding that the officer's identity be revealed and a transparent investigation be launched. Posts from social organizations with messages like, "If there is no change, we will not stay silent," were widely shared, strengthening the campaign's momentum. Social media was no longer just a place to share information. It became a platform to apply pressure on authorities. This was no longer a personal incident but a social issue. The sense that justice had been denied brought people together like never before. Protests were being planned in both large and small cities across every platform. People were no longer silent. Their anger at the police's actions was real, and they wanted everyone responsible to be held accountable. It wasn't only individuals who spoke up. Social organizations, influential figures, and celebrities joined the movement. They shared the video, organized campaigns, and brought more attention to the case. From Hollywood stars to social activists, all spoke out together. Angela's story became a symbol in the fight against racism, oppression, and abuse of power in society. Questions about police authority, injustice in law enforcement, and racism in society were raised with urgency. The online community now wanted more than justice for Angela. They wanted to change what was broken in the system so no one else would have to endure such violence and discrimination again. The emotions stirred by the video were not just outrage, but hope for real change. People believed that if enough voices spoke up, if the community stood strong, justice could be served and injustices like this would no longer be tolerated. The calls to action, the posts, the hashtag Justice for Angela became rallying cries, declarations from a generation fighting for human rights and justice. What seemed like a random moment captured on video awakened an entire community's rage and hunger for justice. It was no longer just a plea for one woman, but a demand for change for all who had been oppressed. After the video of Angela being tied to a tree spread widely, officers Darren Matthews and Tommy, the two directly involved, were suspended while an official investigation was launched. Both men, having served in the force for years, never expected their actions to lead to such serious consequences. They now faced not only public criticism, but also scrutiny from within their own department. Inside the police station's meeting room, the atmosphere was tense. Debates broke out among officers about the nature of the incident. Some believed the use of force was necessary in that situation, while others argued that the actions of Matthews and Tommy were excessive and violated professional standards. One of Matthews' colleagues, Sergeant James, a longtime officer, entered the room and looked at Matthews without sympathy. "You went too far," Sergeant James said coldly. "We can't act like that. Not toward the people, not in this kind of situation." His words hit Matthews like a slap, making him realize that condemnation wasn't just coming from the public, but also from within the force itself. Even among officers, some felt ashamed and unsettled by what had happened. Throughout the investigation, police officials focused on clarifying the details of Matthews' and Tommy's actions. This only made Matthews more uncomfortable. He had always seen himself as someone doing his job, maintaining order and justice, but now his career was on the line. Questions were raised, not only about how he acted, but also about the motives behind his aggression. In a meeting, when asked why he treated Angela that way, Matthews couldn't hide his anger. He answered, "We can't just let people like her hang around this neighborhood. She was a threat, and I was doing my job." Matthews' reasoning only increased the tension in the room. Investigators were not convinced by his explanation. They sensed something deeper was wrong, and they knew it couldn't be ignored. "This isn't about doing the job. This is about racism," one investigator said, making clear their concern. "We can't allow this kind of behavior to stay in the force. Change has to happen." As the investigation grew more detailed, public reaction intensified. Social organizations and civil rights groups that had followed the case from the beginning now escalated their push for justice. Advocates for black rights spoke out forcefully, emphasizing that Matthews' actions were a clear example of racial discrimination. The media also joined the effort, not just reporting the case, but highlighting the broader issues surrounding how law enforcement treats people of color. "Justice cannot be delayed. We all see the discrimination," read a social media post from a civil rights group that drew widespread attention. The calls demanding justice for Angela continued to grow. Online discussions intensified, with millions of shares and comments. Black rights organizations repeatedly demanded a fair investigation and urged strong action from the government and relevant authorities. The outrage did not stay within activist groups. It spread across all levels of society. Public opinion began raising hard questions about how law enforcement treats minority groups, especially black people. Even those not directly connected to the case joined the movement, amplifying the call for strict accountability for officers who acted wrongly. As the investigation dug deeper, Matthews and Tommy were forced to face an unavoidable truth. Not everyone saw them as officers simply doing their jobs. Questions from investigators mounted, increasing the pressure. Their justifications failed to convince anyone. Matthews tried to defend himself, claiming his actions were reasonable and necessary to maintain order, but all of that was dismissed by the evidence and by what the public had already seen. This only made the debate within the police force more tense. Some who had initially supported Matthews began to reconsider how officers handle situations involving people of color. Were those methods truly justified, or were they just tactics to preserve power for those in uniform? Others argued that this was the time for serious reform in policing, from retraining officers to overhauling how their actions are monitored. One investigator, after hearing all of Matthews' explanations, could no longer hide his frustration. "This is a clear sign of racial bias," he said, his voice tight. "We cannot let this be a precedent. Change must happen now." His words cast a shadow over the entire police force, a warning that reform was no longer optional. Angela's story had now moved beyond the personal. It had become a fight for justice and for the rights of those facing discrimination. Matthews and Tommy were no longer just the subjects of a simple inquiry. They were at the center of a policing crisis and a challenge to the legal system. Questions of fairness and power kept echoing, and this official investigation was only the first step in a long and difficult road ahead. Immediately after the video of Angela being tied to a tree became a storm across social media platforms, the public's outrage didn't stay in online comments, but turned into real action. Social organizations, from human rights groups to civil rights advocates, began speaking out strongly in support of Angela. They not only demanded justice for her, but also pushed for broader reform within the police force. These voices were not just seeking fairness for one person, but were a warning to the entire justice system, calling for a change in how law enforcement treats minority communities. A well-known activist who had led many human rights campaigns spoke during a live press conference. "We will not stop until justice is served. This is not just about Angela, this is about all of us." These words rang out as a promise to other victims in society, affirming that the fight would not end until these injustices were addressed. Meetings and discussions between social leaders and organizations continued nonstop, pushing forward a campaign to change both policies and police behavior. At the same time, protests erupted across the country. From major cities like New York and Los Angeles to smaller towns, thousands poured into the streets, holding banners and chanting demands for immediate change. Matthews was no longer the sole target of the protesters. The police force itself, with its deep issues of racism and abuse of power, was now being held accountable. The protest was no longer about one person. It was a battle against an unjust system. On crowded streets, chants like "No more racism" and "Justice for Angela" echoed, and those marching were not just everyday citizens but also activists, families, and social influencers. Angela had become a powerful symbol in the struggle, not just a victim of wrongdoing, but the spark that ignited a wave of demands for justice. Protesters of all backgrounds stood united, calling for complete and lasting change. As the government witnessed the force of the protests and the massive shift in public opinion, it could no longer stay silent. Political leaders who had previously been cautious began to respond. Authorities not only expressed concern over the growing protests, but also started to reassess police policies and procedures. One government official stated during a press conference, "We need to change the way we see and act. Maintaining order cannot come at the cost of violating human rights." The government's response was welcomed by the public, but they still felt it wasn't enough. Protesters didn't stop at demanding a fair investigation into Angela's case. They called for a deeper, systemic change in how law enforcement operates. They wanted more than punishment for officers who abused their power. They demanded reforms that would ensure such incidents could never happen again. Angela, though a victim of an unjust system, had now become a voice for change. She began appearing in the media, sharing her story with strength and clarity. Each time she spoke, she didn't just talk about the pain she endured, but about the changes she hoped to see in society. She was no longer simply someone who had been oppressed. She had become a leader in the fight for justice. In a live interview with a national news channel, when asked about what she had gone through, Angela looked directly into the camera and said, "What they did to me doesn't matter as much as what we're going to change. That's what I'm fighting for. not revenge, but a more just society. Her words echoed deeply with viewers, serving as a powerful call not just for her own justice, but for all who have been oppressed. Durant's lip class, she became an inspiration to thousands, especially women and people of color who had long been ignored by the police and society. Each time she spoke, her words sparked a desire for change in those who listened. Angela wasn't just demanding justice for herself, but for all those living under oppression and discrimination. She didn't only condemn Matthew's actions, she condemned the system that produced men like Matthews, men who lacked empathy and abused their authority without shame. Angela's voice was no longer just her own. It became the voice of all those pushed aside by society, those judged only by the color of their skin. She continued to appear at community gatherings, on television programs, and across social media, tirelessly pushing the campaign for police reform and justice for all. With every interview, every time she told her story, support for Angela grew stronger. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for a generation that wants to live in a world without discrimination. Angela's fight had moved beyond the personal. Her story, though it began with Officer Matthews' wrongdoing, had become a symbol of something much larger. Not just the fight against racism, but a fight against a long-standing, unjust, oppressive system. Angela had become the leader of that fight, and the community, along with social organizations, stood with her, pushing the movement forward until justice was finally served. After the video of Angela being tied to a tree spread across social media, it quickly became a symbol of the fight against racism, a movement that challenged not only police abuse of power, but also affirmed the rights of people of color who had been treated unfairly. Social media was not just a space for sharing information, but a platform for organizing and driving change. The images in the video touched the hearts of millions, making it impossible for them to stay silent. That scene was not just an isolated incident. It was a wake-up call about the persistent racism in society. The video was not just passed around, it became a campaign, and each share was a powerful call for change. One protester on social media wrote, "She's not just a victim of racism, she's a symbol of the fight for justice." That comment reflected not only what had happened to Angela, but also confirmed that her story revealed the painful truth of an unjust system. Civil rights organizations, long committed to the fight for justice, could not let this incident be dismissed as an isolated case. It had become a defining moment, stirring unity within the community and fueling the movement to demand change in how the police operate. Protests across cities continued on a growing scale. Each demonstration was not only a resistance by those who had faced racism, but also by those who stood in solidarity, believing in fairness and equality for all. People took to the streets with banners, slogans, and chants demanding change. It wasn't just ordinary citizens, activists, social organizations, and influential figures all raised their voices. A well-known activist spoke at a protest. "We can't keep standing still. Don't let her be the last one to suffer." These words ignited the desire for change in everyone present, a call that couldn't be ignored, a reminder that silence only allows injustice to deepen. The community's emotions grew more intense. Discussions about justice spread from small local gatherings to national forums and major social media platforms, where people shared their own stories of racism and the pain they had endured. It was no longer just about anger at Officer Matthews' actions. It was a call for the oppressed to rise, to unite, and to transform the system. Posts carried not only outrage, but also pleas for equality and a society free from discrimination. A woman in the community said, "We need a world without discrimination, where all of us are valued." Her words were not just a statement of belief in justice, but a declaration of human rights. They awakened people from silence, reminding them that everyone deserves to be treated equally and fairly, regardless of race, gender, or background. These words became a powerful message for protests and campaigns demanding change in police policies and procedures. The anger didn't stop at the streets. It created real pressure on the government and social institutions. Police leaders and government officials could no longer ignore the voice of the public. Demands for reform became louder and more urgent than ever. Outrage and expectation drove the movement forward, and no one could remain on the sidelines. Authorities began to realize that change could not be delayed. They faced the reality that every action would now be watched and judged, if not carried out with fairness and transparency. One post on social media made this clear. No more racism. No more police abuse. It's time for change. That post felt like the closing line to a series of actions, a declaration of resistance against injustice. Its sharp words captured not only the public's anger, but also became a driving force that pushed people, from activists to ordinary citizens, to rise and fight for a just society. They demanded not only justice for Angela, but sweeping change in how the police interact with minority communities. As protests continued, the resistance grew into an organized campaign led by civil rights organizations, social activists, and increasingly gained international attention. Groups like Black Lives Matter and others advocating for the rights of people of color raised their voices, calling for change in the legal and law enforcement systems. Every protest, every social media post became a step forward in the fight not just for one individual's justice, but for all those facing oppression. But this fight was more than a call for justice. It marked the beginning of a shift in mindset. Everyone involved carried a desire for change, a vision of a society free from discrimination. The conversations no longer focused only on police abuse, but on how society views and treats those who are different. Protesters stood not just for themselves, but for future generations who deserve to live in a more equal world. Social media became more than an outlet for outrage. It was the foundation of unity. Stories of racism and struggle were shared constantly, reminding people that this fight belongs to anyone who believes in justice and equality. Angela was no longer just a victim. She had become a symbol of a greater movement, a torch lighting the way for all who seek change. After Angela's case shook society, government agencies began to clearly recognize the seriousness of the incident. It was no longer just about the misconduct of a single officer. It was about a deeper issue within the police system and how it had treated minority communities. Officers Matthews and Tommy were no longer the only ones held responsible. The investigation quickly expanded, not just into their individual actions, but into the procedures, standards, and operations of the police force itself. This was not merely personal misconduct, but a sign of a broader problem, one that had persisted for years without being properly addressed. An investigator stated during a meeting, "This isn't just individual behavior. It's a larger issue. There must be a change." His words rang out in the room, a warning to the entire police system and a reminder of the responsibility carried by those within it. People could no longer ignore the failures that the system had allowed to continue. Every authority involved began to see this not as an isolated case, but as part of a series of problems rooted in how the police force functions. The government, now facing public outrage and pressure from social organizations, could no longer remain silent. A series of meetings were held to discuss police reform. Some political leaders reacted strongly, stating that the officers' behavior was unacceptable and that real measures had to be taken. However, others tried to ease the tension, claiming that the actions of Matthews and Tommy did not represent the entire force. They argued that a few extreme cases shouldn't define the whole system. Yet, while some hesitated, others pushed hard for real change. One official said during a meeting, "We can't let this incident stain the entire system. There must be a clear change." These words were more than an acknowledgement of the problem. They were a call to action and a demand for meaningful reform. In that context, the government began to introduce initial reforms, though they remained controversial. One of the first steps was increased oversight of police conduct. These early measures marked a shift in how the police would be held accountable, though much work remained. Officers would now be required to operate under tighter supervision to ensure that violent actions like those against Angela would not be repeated. One official stated during a meeting, "We will implement real changes so that no one has to suffer like Angela again." His words were not just a promise, they were a statement of a future where every citizen has the right to be protected and treated fairly. These reforms, though still in early stages, showed a recognition by those in power that the system could not remain as it was. Angela's case had exposed more than a single failure. It had brought to light the urgent need to re-examine and reshape how justice is administered, especially for the most vulnerable. The road ahead would be difficult, but the first step had finally been taken. Alongside monitoring police conduct, another important reform was the strengthening of training on racial bias and civil rights for law enforcement officers. This was not just a procedural shift, but a change in how officers perceive and interact with the communities they serve. Police officers are not only protectors, they are also partners within the community. This transformation requires time, but it is a necessary step to rebuild trust between the police force and marginalized community. A government official stated, "We cannot stop at temporary measures. Reform is essential and must be carried out thoroughly so that no one has to endure what Angela did." However, change in policing could not be limited to internal reforms. The resistance from the community and the weight of public pressure demanded that law enforcement alter not only its behavior toward individuals but also how it communicates and works with the public. Training programs would now need to focus not just on operational skills but also on civil rights, racial sensitivity, and professional ethics. A newly trained officer said during a meeting, "I will work to protect, not to divide." This marked a significant shift in mindset and behavior, from a force that imposed order through power to one that worked with communities to support and protect without discrimination. Naturally, change within the police system could not happen overnight. Reforms take time to implement, and throughout this process, internal resistance is inevitable. Still, the community, especially those who had suffered from abuse and racism, could not afford to wait any longer. They continued to fight for deeper changes and demanded that the government take bolder action. While the first reforms were meaningful, the public knew they were not enough. Justice and equality could not remain empty promises. They had to be fulfilled in every aspect of society, from the police to broader public policy. Ultimately, transforming the police and their relationship with the community is a complex process, but this movement has begun. Angela's story, though it started with one act of police abuse, became the spark that ignited a demand for change across the nation. Her actions were not just personal resistance. They were part of a larger struggle for justice and human rights for all those treated unfairly. The early reforms, though modest, were a critical foundation for building a more just society. As Angela's fight for justice spread further, the voices from the community could no longer be ignored. After powerful protests and calls for reform from social organizations, the government and police were finally forced to confront demands that could not be postponed. The community began to re-examine the deep-rooted problems in the policing system, and the first reforms were put into motion. These changes were not just about addressing individual misconduct. They marked an important step toward transforming an entrenched system. Government officials and social leaders met frequently to discuss the next steps in implementing these reforms thoroughly. The first reforms introduced included changes to police recruitment and training processes. A lawmaker stated during a critical meeting, "We need real change, not just hollow promises." These words reflected dissatisfaction with past reform efforts, which had been superficial and failed to address the core issues. These new demands pushed authorities into a position where swift and decisive action was necessary. The police could no longer operate under outdated procedures that allowed officers to abuse power without accountability. New training programs were launched, focusing on how officers could not only follow regulations but also understand and respect the human rights of all citizens, especially those from minority communities. One of the key elements of reform was reshaping the recruitment process, not only seeking technical skill but also emphasizing moral character and the ability to work with the public. Officers must be people who understand civil rights, who know how to work with respect, not as enforcers who control through power. As the reforms began to take shape, the community did not stay passive. They continued to show strong solidarity, demanding justice not only for Angela but for everyone who had endured racial discrimination in society. Social organizations, Black advocacy groups, and all those affected by injustice rose together to demand a foundation of fairness and equality for everyone. Their actions were not just resistance, they were a demand for systemic change across the board. A member of the community, speaking during a protest, said, "Now is the time for all of us to stand together. No one stands alone." These words expressed not only unity, but also the truth that this fight was not just Angela's. It belonged to all who had been oppressed or cast aside by society. No one could remain on the sidelines anymore, because injustice did not touch only one person, it lived throughout the system. The community was not just seeking justice for Angela, they were fighting for complete change, so no one would have to live in fear and discrimination again. As the community continued to call for change, social organizations began engaging in nationwide conversations about how to address racial discrimination. These discussions did not stop at condemning Matthew's actions. They expanded into broader questions about how law enforcement and society as a whole view and treat Black people. Civil rights groups organized seminars, met with social leaders, and promoted community education around human rights and equality. One social organization stated during a press conference, "We need to start from the beginning with education and training about justice." This was a powerful call for comprehensive reform in how justice and racism are taught. Educational leaders also joined the conversation, recognizing that no lasting change could occur without a shift in collective mindset and awareness. Educational reform became a key part of addressing racism, as only younger generations could challenge and change deeply rooted societal prejudices. This transformation did not stay theoretical. It began to take form in practice. Reforms were put in place, from revising police recruitment and training to rebuilding trust between law enforcement and the community. One crucial measure was the implementation of police oversight programs, ensuring that every action taken by officers would be transparent and subject to external review. The community would not stop speaking out if abuses continued. A new officer, participating in the dialogue, said, "We will do what's best for the community." This marked a key moment in changing how the police think and act, not just working under supervision, but working for the trust and benefit of the people. The early reforms, though still incomplete, signaled a major shift in how the police system operated. The community began to feel this movement, but they also knew the fight could not end with the first few steps. They understood that many challenges lay ahead. Angela and those who supported her were fighting not just for her justice, but for all who had been ignored and mistreated by the system. The reforms the government began were only the starting point. Achieving a fair society would require continued resistance, persistent demands, and constant effort to ensure equality for everyone. The national conversation on racism and civil rights pushed forward with strength. The community did not stop but continued pressing for deeper and broader reforms. The discussions and actions not only helped clarify the issues, but also laid the foundation for building a more just society, where every citizen, regardless of race or ethnicity, has the right to live and work in an environment of equality. What began with Angela had now become a powerful movement, not only against racism but for the human rights of all who have been oppressed. After a long period of struggle, change within the police force began to take shape. Training programs and reforms were put into action, gradually making a noticeable difference that people could feel. Newly trained officers were not only equipped with technical knowledge, but they were also required to learn how to work with the community, respect human rights, and understand the importance of protecting all citizens regardless of race. Angela may not have directly participated in the reform process, but her story became a catalyst for change. She was the one who opened up the conversation about racial discrimination in law enforcement, and now she could witness the first results of her persistent efforts. A new officer, having just completed training, shared during a meeting, "I now understand more clearly the responsibility I carry." These words were not just a personal admission, They were a statement from an entire generation of police officers being retrained. They understood that their duty was not only to enforce the law, but also to build trust with the community, ensuring that everyone felt protected and respected. This shift in training and mindset slowly began to change the way officers interacted with the public. Angela was no longer the only one who had to face injustice, but her story had become a shared cause for all those fighting for a fairer society. Angela, after all she had endured, was no longer just a victim. She had become a symbol of change, not only within the police force but across society. She continued to participate in discussions about justice and civil rights, sharing her story with the hope of helping others who were still being treated unfairly. She was not just a symbol, she was an active voice, speaking up for those who could not speak for themselves. Angela spoke at a community gathering. "We cannot let what happened to me happen to anyone else. We have to keep fighting." These words reflected not only the pain she had experienced, but also a call to those still being oppressed to raise their voices and stand up for justice. She didn't want her story to become just another example of injustice. She wanted it to be the starting point for real change. Her words were a promise that the fight for justice would not end until no one had to suffer discrimination or oppression again. While Angela continued to fight for justice, the police force continued to implement broad reforms. Change did not stop at recruitment and training procedures. It included a complete transformation in how police viewed and worked with the public. Law enforcement agencies gradually began rebuilding trust with communities. Oversight measures, renewed training on civil rights and racial bias, and efforts to improve the relationship between police and the public became essential steps in this process. A police leader shared during a reform meeting, "We need change not only in our actions but in our thinking." This statement clearly reflected the police department's realization that only a shift in mindset could create a just society, where everyone's civil rights are protected and respected. Officers were no longer working solely with the goal of maintaining order, but with a commitment to human rights, creating a sustainable relationship between the police force and the community. Reform in policing is a long and difficult process, but the first steps have already been taken. Citizens, especially those who had experienced racial discrimination, began to feel the difference. They no longer felt fear every time they saw a police car. Instead, they started to trust that officers were truly doing their job to protect them. However, reform is not a simple or short process. Police departments must continue to learn and grow, and most importantly, they must stay committed to the communities they serve. Alongside changes within the police, another important shift was the growing unity within the community. Lessons from the past have shown that racism is not just a problem for those who suffer from it, but one that affects all of society. The community began to come together, no longer divided by race or background, but united in pursuit of justice and equality for all. A community member shared at a gathering, "We've been able to create change, but the fight isn't over." These words acknowledged the progress made, while reminding everyone that the struggle could not end with a few initial reforms. The community must keep fighting and keep believing in a just society. This change was felt not only through reforms in policing, but as an awakening within the community itself. People came to understand that justice is not something one person or one group can claim alone. It is a collective responsibility. Angela was not only the one who sparked the conversation about racism, she was also the one who lit the flame of change, helping people see that this fight must continue and that the rights of the oppressed must be defended. The new life Angela helped shape was not just a shift in policing, it was a shift in society. Angela became a symbol of resistance, not only fighting for her own justice, but for everyone who had suffered under racism. She was the light that ignited the hearts of those pained by injustice, a source of hope for a fairer and equal future. After Angela's story spread, the community's response didn't stop at criticism or outrage. Civil rights groups, social organizations, and activists began organizing public forums on racism and justice. These gatherings were not only spaces where victims of racism could be heard, but opportunities for them to share their stories, helping others understand the pain and injustice they had endured. These were not just moments for releasing emotion, they were the first steps for the community to confront the truth, ensuring no one would have to face this struggle alone. A community member speaking at one of these forums said, "We've seen enough injustice. It's time for people to really listen." This was more than an acknowledgement of what had happened. It was a powerful call for change. Society needed to hear from the victims of racism, to face the reality that justice had not always been served fairly. The stories of people like Angela, those who had suffered and fought back, were warnings that could no longer be ignored. The community began to change, not just in action, but in perspective on racism. These public forums help people realize that one person's pain is not a private matter. It's a reflection of a broader social issue. Angela was not just a victim. Her story spoke for millions experiencing the same injustice. The community started to understand its role in creating a fairer society. These painful stories became lessons in resilience and calls to action, demanding real change within the entire system. A social leader said during a seminar, "Justice cannot be just a slogan. It has to be practiced through action." This statement served as a reminder for everyone involved in the movement. Justice couldn't live only in meetings or conversations. It had to be made real through concrete steps and meaningful work. Calling for justice was not enough without real change, and every individual and organization had a responsibility to ensure that these calls weren't forgotten. The stories, the sharing, and the actions would fuel the community to keep moving forward, not only for Angela, but for everyone who had been pushed aside. The community began to deeply understand the presence of racism in society. Small but meaningful changes started to appear within families, schools, and organizations. Change didn't come all at once, but the first steps had been taken. In the forums and discussions, people didn't just hear stories of pain, they started reflecting on how they themselves had viewed and treated those who were different. Stories like Angela's made people think again, face truths they had never fully considered before. The community no longer viewed racism as a surface issue, they began to feel its deep impact across every layer of society. A participant in the reform program shared, "We're learning to see what we've never seen before." These words reflected a shift in community awareness, from those who once ignored such issues to those now beginning to understand and truly feel the injustice surrounding them. Small changes in daily life began to emerge, from parents talking to their children about racism to schools including lessons on civil rights and mutual respect in their curriculum. Social organizations started implementing workshops and training programs on recognizing and combating racism, aiming to educate the next generation from an early age. The sense of change didn't stop at awareness. It expanded into real action. Organizations began calling for deeper reforms in public policy, demanding greater accountability from government agencies and law enforcement in delivering justice for all. That momentum became a powerful force, inspiring a new generation of leaders and everyday citizens to stand up and demand a fairer society. Protests and social campaigns were no longer just spontaneous reactions. They became part of an ongoing movement for equality and civil rights for everyone. The reach of these efforts extended beyond local communities and became a global movement. Media outlets, social organizations, and political leaders began voicing their support for what Angela and the community had started. A journalist wrote, "We cannot go back to the way things were. Justice must be delivered." These words were not only a reflection of society's changing mindset, but also a warning to those attempting to ignore this fight. Protests and advocacy campaigns captured public attention and sent a strong message to politicians that change could no longer be delayed. The impact of Angela and the community had grown to a level that no one could deny. Her story was not only an example of injustice, but a wake-up call to society that racism cannot continue in a world where everyone deserves equal rights. These efforts succeeded in opening up a powerful conversation, not just nationally but globally, offering hope to all those still fighting for human rights. Angela's courage and the community's unity helped light a path forward. What began with pain and injustice became the seed of transformation, proving that through collective effort, awareness, and persistence, a more just and equal society is not just possible, it is within reach. The fight for justice that Angela began did not stop with a single event. It spread wider, creating a far-reaching movement. Black advocacy organizations like Black Lives Matter not only drew strong support from the community but also captured the attention of other social groups. This movement was not simply a reaction to racial discrimination by police officers. It was a call for justice for all victims of injustice in society. Protests erupted across cities, from densely populated urban areas to small towns, with chants demanding a fair and equal society. Civil rights groups and other social organizations quickly joined the cause, strengthening the movement and making it a vital part of the fight against a racially biased system. A protester declared passionately, "The whole world is watching, and we will not let justice be ignored." These words reflected not only public attention but also a statement from a community ready to stand up for its rights. Global awareness of the protests proved the power of this movement. It was not only a struggle of Black people, it belonged to everyone who believed in justice and equality. The community was no longer silent in the face of racism. They rose up to show that change was possible. Angela, once just a woman who suffered injustice, had now become a symbol of the fight for justice and civil rights. Stories about Angela and others like her were not only sources of inspiration, they sparked action. She continued to take part in protests and justice campaigns, not only to demand accountability from abusive officers, but to push for broader change in society, giving a voice to the oppressed. Angela became a leading figure in community discussions on fairness, on the rights of Black people and other marginalized groups, encouraging everyone to join the movement, not only to protect themselves, but to help create a more equal society for all. In a public interview, Angela spoke with strength. "I'm not just fighting for myself, I'm fighting for everyone crushed by this system." That statement affirmed that this fight was never hers alone. It belonged to all those who had been treated unfairly. She was fighting not only for her own justice, but for those who had suffered deeply from racial discrimination. Angela's words became a source of strength, a fire that lit the hearts of those filled with hope and a thirst for justice. She became a model of a woman who would not be broken, and her story became a symbol for anyone standing up for their rights. The protests sparked by Angela's experience became part of a larger awakening. Across communities, the energy of these new demonstrations showed no sign of fading. People from all walks of life joined forces, building momentum toward a shared goal. What began as a personal injustice had now grown into a global demand for reform, powered by unity, determination, and a belief that justice must be for everyone. This movement was not only powerfully embraced by the community, but also drew attention from political organizations, lawmakers, and high-ranking officials. The protests were not limited to the country, but echoed across other nations, where justice-minded people stood up and shared their voices with Angela and the movement. She was not just a victim of racial discrimination, but a guiding light for a social revolution, a fight not only to protect the rights of Black people, but to declare that no one should be left behind in this life. These new protests were not simply the result of a single event, but the outcome of long strides in the human rights movement, a societal awakening. Angela became the leading figure, the one at the forefront of this fight, and she would continue until no one had to endure racial injustice again. The fight for justice and equality did not stop at domestic protests, but quickly spread globally. When the voices of the community were ignored, the protests became more than just national acts. They turned into a worldwide movement, supported and joined by millions across the globe. Participants were not just reacting to one officer or one incident. They were demanding a deeper transformation of society. These changes began to show within communities where people no longer feared standing up for their rights. The streets were no longer seen as places for vague or spontaneous protests, but as gathering grounds for those bold enough to confront injustice and the systems that had upheld racial discrimination for decades. Fear gave way to resilience and a fierce desire for change. A protester in the crowd, seeing the massive turnout, declared, "This is only the beginning. It won't stop until everyone is treated equally." His words were not just a reflection of the movement's goal, but a statement of resolve. Protesters no longer viewed this struggle as a short-term fight, but as a long journey toward real social transformation. Every protest, every meeting, every social media post became a step forward. They knew change wouldn't come overnight, but they also knew that if they didn't act now, real change might never come. It wasn't only civil rights groups and social organizations. Civil communities also joined the fight, working together to confront racial discrimination, not just in policing but in government institutions. Dialogues between charities, rights groups, and government agencies evolved from simple exchanges into foundations for real reform. Angela and those beside her were not just calling for changes in police behavior, but pushing for broader policy reforms, demanding that governments treat all citizens fairly, regardless of race or background. These organizations were no longer small collectives. They had become powerful forces, shaping a movement for justice that could no longer be ignored. A community organizer spoke during a joint meeting, "We need to act together to build a society without discrimination." This statement clearly reflects the need for collaboration from every sector of society to create lasting change. It is not only the responsibility of social organizations or long-time activists, but every member of the community must take part in this process. The entire society must join hands to eliminate racial discrimination, not just in policing but across all areas of life. Major changes must begin with small yet powerful actions from individuals, organizations, and communities. These discussions did not only focus on legal issues or reform demands, but expanded into broader dialogues about social equality. Civil rights groups began to develop strategies not only to demand justice for the oppressed, but to create opportunities for minority groups to grow and gain rightful places in society. The struggle was not just about resistance. It was about creating a society where every citizen has the opportunity to live equally. The involvement of charitable organizations, community groups, and political leaders became a crucial factor in ensuring that these changes did not remain surface level but could lead to deep, lasting transformations within the social and political system. These conversations were not just theoretical debates, but real meetings aimed at proposing concrete reforms, ensuring that every action was monitored and evaluated to protect the rights of all citizens. The wave of change kept growing, from the streets where protests took place to the political rooms where key reform decisions were made. Organizations, social groups, and everyone involved in this movement understood that they could not let justice be ignored. Angela's story sparked a much larger fight, one where every person had a role in building a fair, inclusive society. This fight was not only about one woman who was oppressed, but about justice and rights for all who had been pushed to the margins of society. When the video of Angela spread and shocked the community, the authorities could no longer remain idle. An official investigation was launched and quickly expanded, not only focusing on the misconduct of Officer Matthews and Officer Tommy, but also serving as an opportunity to re-examine the entire policing system. The government, along with social organizations and citizens protesting racial injustice, demanded a transparent and comprehensive inquiry. It was not just about identifying individual wrongdoing, but addressing the deeper issue, a system that fosters and sustains abuse of power. An investigator stated firmly during a meeting, "This is not just an isolated incident. This is a systemic problem that must be changed." These words do not only criticize the actions of Matthews and Tommy, but also make it clear that without reforming the entire structure and mindset within law enforcement, such incidents would keep happening. This created a major clash between those pushing for reform and those within the police force who felt under attack. Veteran officers who had served for decades could not help but feel threatened by the demand for changes. They believed their profession was being unfairly criticized, and their integrity was called into question. One senior officer shared in a private meeting, "What is justice if we're not protected? But I also understand that what's wrong must be fixed." His statement revealed the internal conflict experienced by many seasoned officers. They acknowledged flaws in their practices, but also felt hurt and unjustly blamed. They saw themselves as fulfilling their duty to protect society, yet now faced condemnation for the failures of others within their ranks. This conflict sparked intense debate within law enforcement over whether these reforms were truly necessary. Some argued the system itself was not the problem, only a few bad actors. However, others believed that without deep, structural change, the police force could not regain public trust. Comments made in internal meetings and dialogues between officers highlighted the growing divide within the force, between those willing to embrace reform and those clinging to traditional practices. Nevertheless, the community and civil rights groups were not easily convinced. They demanded changes not just in individual behavior but in the very policies and procedures governing law enforcement. Their calls extended beyond punishment for Matthews and Tommy, pushing for stricter oversight and clear accountability for every officer's actions. This placed immense pressure on authorities and police leadership. The central question became how to protect citizens' rights while maintaining a police force capable of preserving public order. Angela and those who stood with her in the fight for justice were not simply demanding an investigation into Matthews's actions. They were calling for real change in the way the police system operates. The protests and demands for reform continued relentlessly, and every statement from public figures, social organizations, and politicians emphasized that justice could not wait. Angela not only wants punishment for the officers who acted wrongly, she wants a policing system that is transparent and fair, one with no room for racism or abuse of power. The entire community, strongly supported by social organizations and human rights advocates, kept pushing for deep and meaningful changes. The investigations were not just about securing justice for Angela. They were an opportunity to reassess how the police force functions and to confront the reality that part of the system needs reform. This incident was not just a lesson in justice for Angela. It was a lesson for the entire society about how we confront injustice and how justice must be implemented fairly and equally. After a tense and thorough investigation, the final results were announced. Officer Matthews and Officer Tommy, who were directly involved in the violent act against Angela, were found guilty. They faced serious penalties, which served as punishment for the abuse they had committed. While the verdict offered a measure of justice for Angela, to society, it was just the tip of the iceberg. Real reform within the police and law enforcement institutions would take time and could not be achieved overnight. The policing system could not be transformed by one single case. It required sweeping and systemic reform to prevent similar actions in the future. An investigator, after announcing the results of the inquiry, stated, "There is no tolerance for such actions. We must set an example for the future." That statement referred not only to Matthews and Tommy, but also served as a reminder of law enforcement's responsibility to uphold fairness and professional ethics. Every action taken by an officer affects more than just individuals. It impacts society as a whole. Wrongdoing must be addressed firmly to set a standard for others and to prevent recurrence. The investigator stressed that without accountability, cases like Angela's would keep happening, and no one in this society could feel truly safe. However, even though the officers were convicted and part of justice was served, the community was not fully satisfied. For Angela and those fighting for justice, this was only the beginning. They demanded deeper changes, not only in policing but also within the legal and political systems. These reforms couldn't be just minor adjustments. They had to be a fundamental shift in how laws are enforced, in how officers interact with the community, and how they work with minority groups. The community didn't only want punishment for the individuals who broke the law. They wanted comprehensive reform to ensure that racism and abuse of power could no longer survive within the system. Someone in the community, speaking during a reform discussion, said, "We don't just need punishment, we need systemic change." That statement reflected the community's frustration that the reforms so far were not strong enough to fully eliminate racism and abuse within law enforcement. Even though Angela and the community had won an initial victory, they knew justice could not stop at a single conviction. They demanded full-scale reform within the police system, calling for root-level change instead of addressing only the surface. This feeling, although stemming from a small victory, became a powerful driver for the community to keep fighting. They didn't just want officers convicted. They wanted to ensure that all police, regardless of rank or position, would be held accountable for their actions. Justice wasn't just about punishing wrongdoing, it was about rebuilding a fair and transparent system for everyone. The community now understood that this fight was not just for one person, but for all those living under a system filled with injustice and discrimination. With the convictions of Matthews and Tommy, the community felt that part of justice had been achieved, but they also knew the fight was far from over. This was only the first step in a much larger journey, one that demanded change not just in the behavior of a few officers, but throughout the entire justice system and police force. The community knew they had to keep rising, keep pushing for reform, and never stop fighting for a more just society. After intense pressure from the community and social organizations forced the government and the police to confront reality, reforms began to take shape. These first steps were not only about changes in recruitment processes or stricter oversight, but also about shifting how the police force itself operates. Officers now had to undergo strict training in civil rights, human rights, and equality, in addition to being monitored by the community. These reforms were not minor adjustments, but a significant step toward rebuilding trust between the police and the public. A government official stated during a reform meeting, "We cannot stop here. These changes must be the first step in a comprehensive overhaul." These words clearly expressed the government's determination to change the system, not just by holding individuals accountable, but by pushing for deep internal reform. Reform measures went beyond introducing new procedures. They involved transforming how the police functioned and thought. Police officers could no longer enforce justice rigidly. They had to understand and respect the human rights of all citizens, regardless of race or ethnicity. Officers began attending training programs on human rights, racial bias, and justice. These programs not only helped them better understand their responsibilities, but also taught them the importance of building healthy relationships with the community. One officer, after completing the training, shared, "I've learned that we have a tremendous responsibility to protect the community, not to control or divide it." These words reflected not just a sense of duty, but a shift in the mindset of the police force. They no longer viewed the community as a subject to control, but as people they were meant to serve, protect, and support. This was a critical step in changing how police approached both their duties and their relationship with the public. In the past, the police were often seen as those who maintained order at all costs, even when it meant using excessive power. However, current reforms require them to work more closely with the community, not just enforcing laws, but also helping and protecting citizens from injustice and discrimination. This called for a fundamental shift in behavior and training, so officers would understand that their role was to serve the community and safeguard the rights of everyone, not just to maintain order through control and force. This reform process is far from simple and cannot be completed in a short time. Although significant progress has been made, these changes must be maintained and further developed over the long term. The government and the police force must continue improving procedures and oversight measures to ensure these reforms are truly effective and implemented seriously. These efforts are not only essential essential to reducing racial discrimination within the police, but also to building a fairer society where every citizen, regardless of race or gender, has the right to live with respect and protection. Reforming the police is a long-term process, but the first steps have been taken, and they must be sustained and expanded to ensure true justice is upheld. The community continues to monitor the progress of this process, and every step taken by the police force is under close public scrutiny. However, what matters most is that these changes are not just top-down efforts by the authorities, but include the active participation of the entire community. The community is not merely a bystander, but the true driving force behind this change. By standing together and demanding justice and equality, the community has helped transform how the police and the government view and implement justice. The police force began taking major reform steps after the events triggered a powerful shock throughout the community. One of the key reforms was the requirement for officers to participate in training programs on human rights, racial bias, and justice. These programs do not just teach basic professional skills, but emphasize the police's role in protecting the rights and freedoms of all citizens, regardless of race or background. This helps officers not only understand their responsibilities more clearly, but also gain a deeper awareness of the importance of maintaining justice in society. One officer, after completing the training, shared, "I learned that we have a great responsibility to protect the community, not to control or divide it." His words reflect the shift in mindset within the police force, where their duty is no longer seen solely as law enforcers, but as partners with the community, safeguarding human rights in all situations. Meanwhile, the community was not just observing, but actively participating in the reform process. People began to clearly understand that reforming the police force was not a change that could happen in the short term. It was a long process that required persistence and the continued involvement of every individual and organization. The community understood that reform was not solely the responsibility of the government or the police, but a shared duty of everyone. Every person, whether inside the system or outside in society, had to play a role in building a just legal system. One social organization stated, "We must keep fighting, never let these changes fall back." This statement not only affirmed that the fight for justice could not stop, but also served as a reminder that changes in the police force, while important, were only the first step. To create real change, there had to be continuous and sustained participation from the whole society. The community could not simply stand by and watch. For these reforms to take hold and not be forgotten, the participation of all segments of society was essential. Social organizations, community groups, and ordinary citizens had to continue speaking out and demanding that the government implement these reforms fully and seriously. The efforts of Angela and her allies had awakened society to an issue that had long been ignored, but now they could not stop at achieving a few early victories. The community needed to keep pushing forward, protecting these changes and ensuring that the new justice system would be upheld and not weakened by compromise or neglect. Although the reform process was gradually showing positive signs, the community continued to call for deeper, more comprehensive change. They wanted not only the removal of certain individuals within the police force, but also a transformation of the entire system, from recruitment and training procedures to the methods of monitoring and evaluating police actions. The government, alongside the community, had to keep working closely to ensure that these reforms would result in real effectiveness, not just cosmetic changes. These steps were not a one-time event, but part of a long-term process where everyone in society needed to contribute their efforts. Reforming the police force, though difficult, could not succeed without unity and active participation from all sectors of society. After the police reforms were implemented, clear effects began to appear. Officers were retrained, not only in professional skills but also in human rights, justice, and racial discrimination. The shift in how they viewed their work and their relationship with the community became evident. Newly trained officers no longer saw the community as subjects to control, but as people they needed to protect and support. These training programs not only provided them with basic knowledge of civil rights, but also helped them gain a deeper understanding of their role in maintaining a just society. society where everyone had the right to be protected and respected. The way officers interacted with the community also changed, from being present at town halls and participating in community activities to actually listening and responding to people's needs. The community began to see law enforcement not just as an arm of authority, but as partners in protecting citizens' rights, creating a sense of connection rather than opposition. However, these early reforms, though positive, were only the beginning of a long and challenging process. Change within the police force could not stop at initial measures, but had to be sustained and continuously developed. The community, having witnessed the first steps forward, did not settle for satisfaction with what had already been done. They demanded that the reforms not be temporary fixes, but the foundation for how law enforcement would operate in the future. The community was not asking for a one-time change. They wanted these steps to continue, and for the changes to be upheld and expanded, not reversed or weakened over time. The community began to understand that, although these reforms had shown initial positive results, truly building a just society required them to keep pushing and monitoring the process. The government also recognized that change in policing could not rely on a few short-term measures, but had to be part of a long-term plan, with ongoing training programs and community involvement in holding police accountable. The community had to keep advocating for a police force that was fair and transparent, free of racial bias, and respectful of human rights. Social organizations and civil rights groups began launching campaigns to ensure that police reform would not just be a temporary shift, but a continuously evolving process. The community demanded a stronger oversight system with the participation of civil organizations and community groups to ensure every police action was closely monitored and held accountable. Reform could not stop at changing how officers were trained. It had to include improvements in recruitment processes, evaluation methods, and oversight of police conduct. These demands were not only calls for change within the police force, but a broader appeal for systemic reform in the entire justice system. Police reforms would have far-reaching effects, not only changing how officers interact with the community, but also helping to rebuild the public's trust in the legal system. The community needed to continue pushing for this change, not just demanding justice in individual cases, but working toward a fair and transparent justice system for everyone. Police reform, if implemented correctly and sustainably, could be the first step in building a more just society, where the rights of all citizens are protected and respected. Police reform was not a process that could be completed quickly. True change requires ongoing participation from the community and social organizations. The first steps had been taken, but those were just surface-level changes. Real justice could only be achieved if the system were changed from within, not just by reforming the behavior of individuals, but through a comprehensive overhaul of procedures and operations throughout the entire police force. Community discussions continued, and demands for deep structural change in the policing and legal systems grew stronger. The community could not allow these reforms to fade into the background, because if that happened, the chance to build a truly fair and equal society would be lost. Every individual and every social organization had a responsibility to keep pushing for reform, to ensure justice was fully and transparently delivered. Throughout the reform process, the connection between the police and the community became more important than ever. The relationship between the two sides improved not only in communication, but also in how police and citizens learned and worked together. The reforms helped officers not only change how they enforced justice, but also how they built cooperative, respectful relationships. When officers understood their role in protecting the community and justice, when they no longer viewed the public as people to control, but as partners to work with, society began to see real progress. These reforms, though they would take time to fully implement, laid a strong foundation for a more equal society, where every citizen, regardless of race or background, had the right to live with dignity and protection. These reforms not only improved the relationship between the police and the community, but also helped restore trust in the justice system, which had been severely damaged by past abuses of power. The community no longer felt threatened by those tasked with upholding the law. Instead, they began to feel that the police were part of the community, allies in protecting the rights of all citizens. When trust is rebuilt, society gains a stronger foundation to fight for justice and human rights. This is what Angela dedicated herself to, and what those who fought alongside her helped create. Justice is not something that can be achieved by one individual or one group alone, but the result of everyone who believes in equality and in respecting the rights of all people working together. This struggle, although it has achieved some important victories, does not end here. The community and social organizations must continue to monitor and push forward these reforms to safeguard the progress that has been made. Police reform is only the first step, and in order to truly build a just society, every individual and every organization must maintain and advance these changes. Only when society understands that change cannot stop, that justice is not a destination but an ongoing journey, can there be hope for a future free of discrimination, free of abuse of power, and where justice is upheld for all. In recent years, societal change has extended far beyond police reform, spreading strongly into other areas, especially education. Educational programs on justice and human rights have begun to be integrated into schools, aiming to raise young people's awareness of racism, injustice, and equality. These programs don't just teach students theoretical concepts, but also encourage them to recognize and confront racial issues in society, helping them better understand their own rights and responsibilities toward the community. Embedding these values into the curriculum from an early age is a crucial step toward building a generation that thinks and acts responsibly in defending human rights and creating a just society. A teacher shared at an educational meeting, "We can't change society if we don't teach the next generation these values from an early age." This statement highlights the vital role of education in creating lasting change, because only when young people fully understand justice, racism, and human rights can society hope for a future without discrimination. Alongside education, the police force has also begun implementing important reforms, especially in retraining officers. New training programs focus not only on professional skills, but also on equipping officers with knowledge of human rights, racism, and justice. This helps officers better understand their responsibilities to the community and the importance of protecting the rights of all citizens, regardless of race or background. These training programs have changed how police approach their work. They no longer see themselves as enforcers and controllers, but as partners with the community in protecting fairness and respecting human rights. A new officer, after completing training, shared, "We're not just protectors, we're partners of the community." This statement clearly reflects the shift in mindset within the police force, from a body that merely maintains order to active collaborators in ensuring equality and justice for all. However, reforming policing and education is neither easy nor quick. It requires the continued involvement of the community, social organizations, and the government. The community not only demands changes in police behavior, but also calls for systemic change, from altering policies and procedures to implementing strict oversight to ensure that reforms go beyond paper and are actually enforced. The community must also continue to participate in reform programs, monitor progress, and hold authorities accountable for their commitments. While changes have begun, achieving a truly just and equal society requires a major transformation in collective awareness and action across all levels of society. In addition, changes in the police force must be sustained and developed over time. The initial reforms cannot be allowed to become temporary fixes. To create lasting change, the collective will of all sectors of society is needed, from education and government to civil rights organizations and the community. Only when everyone recognizes their role in building a just, non-racist society can the fight for justice truly reach its goal. Reforms in education and law enforcement are just the first steps on this journey, but they demand persistent, tireless effort from all levels of society. The shift in how society reflects on issues of racism and justice comes not only from policy reforms and practical actions, but also from culture and media. Films, television shows, and publications have started to address these issues more clearly and boldly than ever before. Stories about racism, abuse of power, and the fight for justice are no longer limited to academic papers or political debates, but have become central themes in mainstream cultural productions. TV dramas, documentaries, and news articles now openly tackle these painful topics, sparking a wide-ranging social dialogue about core values like fairness, human rights, and equality. The media's spotlight on these stories has significantly transformed public awareness, as topics once overlooked are now openly discussed. A well-known director shared his thoughts on the media's responsibility in shaping public perception. "We have a responsibility to reflect social reality and help shift public awareness." These words not only acknowledge the role of art and media in shaping societal consciousness, but also serve as a reminder of the power of culture to guide society toward change. When stories of racism, abuse, and justice are told through the media, they don't just attract momentary attention, they open the door to deep and lasting discussions on how we can build a more equitable society. This transformation goes beyond awareness and is reflected in community action. After stories like Angela's were widely shared and circulated, communities began participating in efforts to support victims of racism and seek justice. Protests, community meetings, legal aid programs, and educational initiatives not only raised awareness, but also encouraged people to take concrete action to fight for the rights of the oppressed. Those involved in these efforts stood up not just for themselves, but for all who suffer injustice. They demanded justice not only for Angela, but for every other victim in society. The community began to understand that real change requires collective action and cannot rely solely on promises from the government or the police. A participant in the reform program said during a meeting, "We won't stop until no one is treated unjustly." This statement reflects the determination and strength of the community, not only in seeking justice for those who have been and are still being oppressed, but also in building a society where justice is fully and equally enforced for all. These actions, though small, create a powerful ripple effect that makes it impossible for society to forget the demands for justice and equality. It marks the beginning of a movement that fights not just for the rights of one group, but for everyone who has been left out of the justice system. The shift in community action is not just a temporary reaction, but part of a long process that requires the continuous involvement of every individual and organization. Civil rights groups, community organizations, and individuals continue working tirelessly to ensure that the reforms being made do not remain only on paper, but are put into real practice. Justice is not something we demand once, but an ongoing struggle that calls for the participation of everyone in protecting and upholding the values of equality, human rights, and justice. Throughout the fight for justice and equality, discussions about the history of racial discrimination have become an essential part of the process of healing and change. These gatherings are not just opportunities for the community to reflect on and discuss past wrongs, but also foundations for learning from them. These discussions open a space for people to confront the reality of racism and find ways to heal the wounds it has left on society. The community does not stop at criticism or blame, but focuses on understanding the deeper roots of discrimination and finding solutions to overcome them. In a discussion on the past, a community leader stated, "We cannot forget the past, but we can learn from it and make it right." These words emphasize not only the importance of facing the past, but also call on the community not to let history define the future, but to learn from it to build a fairer and more harmonious society. However, recovery cannot be only about looking back at the past. It must also be about looking toward the future. One of the most important steps in healing a community is reconciliation. Reconciliation is not just a theoretical concept, but a practical process where opposing sides, such as marginalized communities and the police force, come together to understand and address long-standing tension. Reconciliation programs have begun, helping racially targeted communities and abusive officers engage in honest dialogue and rebuild the trust that has been broken over time. Reconciliation is not about forgetting the pain and wrongdoings, but about acknowledging them and working together to restore broken relationships. A community member participating in a reconciliation program shared, "Reconciliation is not forgetting, it's rebuilding lost trust." These words are not only an acknowledgement of deep emotional wounds, but also a reminder that reconciliation must be built on understanding and mutual respect. It cannot be a short-term process, but one that demands persistence and commitment from both sides. Societal recovery does not come solely from addressing wrongful actions, but also from the participation of the entire community in changing how people treat each other. Reforming police practices and changing education are only the first steps, but real transformation requires everyone in society to contribute. Reconciliation is not just the responsibility of the oppressed or the racially marginalized, but of all who believe in justice and equality. The community must continue to rise and push for justice, not just in individual cases, but in the effort to build a society free of discrimination, where everyone is respected and treated fairly. Angela's story sparked a conversation not only about past mistakes, but also about the necessary steps to change the system and society. This recovery is not easy and cannot be achieved through a few minor reforms. It requires patience, the participation of every sector of society, from the government and police force to social organizations and individuals. The first steps have been taken, and although the road ahead remains long, with determination and unity from the community, society will gradually become fairer and more equal. Internal changes within the police force have begun to gain momentum, not only reforming procedures and oversight mechanisms, but also transforming the mindset and approach officers take in situations involving civil rights. This shift has been strongly driven by the fight for justice and equality within the community. After undergoing sweeping reforms, the police no longer view their role as simply maintaining social order through authority and control. Instead, they have learned to reevaluate their role in the community. Police officers are not just law enforcers, but defenders of citizens' rights, especially for minority groups and vulnerable individuals in society. One officer, after completing a training course on human rights and justice, shared, "Police are not the enemy of the community. We are its protectors." These words not only reflect a shift in the police force's awareness, but also represent a new approach, one where officers and communities work together to uphold fairness, rather than facing off in conflict and division. However, despite positive reforms in the police sector, the fight against abuse of power is far from over. Social groups, activists, and communities continue to push back against abuse within law enforcement agencies and demand that justice be carried out fairly. Protests, campaigns, and calls for reform persist, keeping pressure on the government and the police force. Social activists and leaders of civil rights organizations are not only demanding punishment for abusive officers, but are also pushing for measures that prevent such behavior at its roots. They are calling on authorities and law enforcement to implement stronger oversight, establish transparent procedures, and protect human rights. These actions are not just immediate reactions, but part of a long-term struggle to build a justice system that is fair to everyone. A social activist, while participating in a discussion on reform, stated, "This fight won't end until we see real change." These words reflect the determination and resolve of those fighting for justice. They are not simply calling for surface-level change, but want these reforms to become an integral part of the justice system. It is a battle that requires ongoing participation from the community and social organization. Although some reforms have been implemented and have had a positive impact, these changes must be sustained and expanded in order to create a truly fair society. These reforms cannot stop at improving officers' behavior, but must involve internal changes to the system itself, from recruitment and training processes to how officers' actions are monitored. Every reform must be accompanied by a shift in mindset and behavior to ensure that all people, regardless of race or ethnicity, are treated fairly and protected from abuse of power. The fight against racism and abuse is not just the responsibility of social organizations, but of the entire society, from the government to the people. Only when everyone commits to pushing for this change can society hope for a future without discrimination, where justice is fully and equally upheld. Although important reforms have been implemented and some positive outcomes have begun to emerge, the fight for justice and equality still faces many challenges. Maintaining and expanding these changes is not a simple task. While the police force and government agencies have begun to carry out reforms, the community continues to face deeply rooted racial discrimination in society. Discriminatory behaviors are no longer as overt as they once were, but they still persist in subtle ways across various aspects of social life, from education and employment to how public institutions handle cases involving people of color. This underlying discrimination is one of the greatest challenges the community must confront. Even though many changes have been made, they are still not enough to eliminate racism completely from society. A legislator said during a meeting, "These changes are only the first step. We still have much more to do." This statement reflects the reality that although there have been major strides in the fight for justice, it is only the beginning. Government agencies, the community, and social organizations must continue to apply pressure and push for reform so that these changes become an essential part of the social structure. These reforms need to be built on a stronger foundation, not just through policies but also in practice, ensuring that every citizen is treated fairly and that no discrimination is present in the actions and decisions of public institutions. The community's response also reflects persistence and determination in this fight. Although progress may be slow and results are not always immediate, the community continues to persevere. Some groups in society feel discouraged when change does not happen as quickly as they had hoped. However, they also understand that significant change takes time. Reform cannot happen overnight. It requires a long-term process with consistent and sustained participation from the community, civil rights organizations, and the government. Despite facing many difficulties and challenges, the community holds firmly to the belief in change. One person in the community shared, "Even though there are many obstacles, we will not stop until we achieve justice." This statement is not only an affirmation of determination, but also a reminder that this fight cannot stop, no matter the difficulties faced. The community understands that every step forward, no matter how small, is meaningful and will help bring about lasting change. This persistence is a crucial factor in ensuring that the reforms will not just be temporary steps, but will become a solid foundation for a just society. The community understands that this change is not solely the responsibility of the government, but the responsibility of everyone in society. Every individual, every organization, and every group needs to contribute to this struggle, because only when everyone is united can the change be sustained in the long term. The difficulties and challenges the community faces cannot weaken their determination. They know that only by continuing the fight can they truly transform society, not just for the present, but for future generations as well. As the fight for justice continues, social consensus around reform becomes increasingly evident. Politicians, community leaders, and social organizations have begun to unite in pushing for deep and widespread changes in society. There is no longer division or conflict among powerful groups. Instead, there is unity in recognizing that the issues of racism and abuse of power within the police force must be addressed thoroughly. Discussions have become more active, not only in political meetings, but also in social groups, non-governmental organizations, and even in everyday conversations among citizens. A political leader, speaking at a reform dialogue, stated, "Justice is not a privilege, it is our obligation to one another." This statement not only affirms the responsibility of the government and public agencies to enforce justice, but also serves as a reminder of the role each individual plays in building a fair society where everyone has a duty to contribute to change. This consensus creates a strong foundation for lasting reform extending beyond police reform into all areas of society. When politicians and community leaders work together to promote change, decisions are no longer based solely on the interests of one group, but on the common good of the whole society. Communities and social organizations play a key role in maintaining this consensus, helping ensure that policies and reforms are carried out fairly and effectively. Demands for justice, equality, and human rights are no longer overlooked, but have become the basis for political and social decision-making. With that unity and determination, the community begins to envision a new future for society, a future where racism no longer exists, where everyone is treated fairly, and where justice is fully realized for all. People no longer look at society with anxiety about discrimination and oppression, but instead with belief in a more just and equal future. Conversations about the future are becoming broader and deeper, focusing not only on reforming institutions or policies, but also on changing the mindset and social perception of rights and justice. The community not only wants to see change in the police force, but also hopes to see a society where people can live and work without fear of being discriminated against or treated unfairly. A community activist stated during a public gathering, "We are building a future where there is no more discrimination." This statement has become a symbol of the community's aspiration, an affirmation that this struggle is not for temporary change, but for a sustainable and just future. The community has begun to believe that, through collective effort, they can build a better society where justice is not a rare privilege, but a basic right for everyone. This future is no longer a distant dream, but a goal that can be achieved if everyone stands together and takes action. Finally, after months of investigation and justice-driven efforts, Matthews and Tommy were convicted. The officers involved in the violent act against Angela could not escape responsibility and were subjected to severe punishment. This marked an important step in ensuring that wrongful actions would not be overlooked. However, while the verdict was a significant part of justice, it was not the end of the struggle. Reform efforts continue, and systemic change in policing remains a demand from the community. This event is only part of a long process that requires change across the entire law enforcement system, from improved training to changes in oversight and law enforcement procedures. Although the officers were held accountable for their actions, the fight to ensure justice for everyone is far from over. One officer, while facing conviction, shared his thoughts. "The truth will always win, no matter how long it takes." This statement reflected his acceptance of the truth and the necessity of justice, even if the process is long and difficult. It was not just a justification for his actions, but an acknowledgement of justice's inevitability. The triumph of justice is not something that comes easily, but is a long process that demands persistence and resilience. Although there are times when the justice system may seem broken, in the end, truth and justice will always find their way. However, justice is not only reflected in verdicts, but must also be realized in the daily life of the community. A shift in societal awareness is just as important. Justice is not just about punishing violators, but involves a deeper transformation in how society perceives and responds to issues of human rights and fairness. Every small act by each individual in the community can contribute to building a just society. These actions, though small, have a major impact in laying a solid foundation for real justice to be practiced. A community member shared during a meeting, "Justice is when all of us act together." These words not only emphasize the need for collective action, but also affirm that justice is not something one person or group can achieve alone. It is the responsibility of the entire society. Justice can only be realized when everyone in the community participates in the process of change, fighting for equality and fairness. The community cannot remain passive and wait for change to come from the authorities or law enforcement. They must take an active role in creating that change. Justice is not only about punishing the offender, but also about ensuring that those who have been racially discriminated against and oppressed can live in a fair society where they do not have to fear being treated unjustly. The shift in the community's perception of justice will be the key factor in building a society without discrimination, where justice is truly upheld. Small actions in each person's daily life, active participation in community programs, and the collective commitment to human rights will be the foundation to ensure that justice is not just a theory, but a right everyone can enjoy. Reforms in the police force have gone beyond changing procedures and officer behavior, extending their influence across all areas of society, from education to law. This change is part of a comprehensive reform process where the values of justice, civil rights, and equality are affirmed and implemented across all social levels. In education, human rights, racial discrimination, and justice have become part of the official curriculum, helping younger generations better understand the issues still present in society and laying the groundwork for a fairer future. Legal organizations have also begun implementing measures to protect the rights of marginalized groups, ensuring that reforms in law enforcement are not merely superficial, but are applied across all aspects of life. These changes are not only directly affecting the police force, but are spreading throughout the entire justice and legal system, creating a new environment where justice and human rights are better protected. An educator spoke on the importance of these changes. This reform will be passed on to the next generations. This statement highlights the critical role of teaching justice and equality to the younger generation, because only when they understand and practice these values can change become an essential part of society. However, these changes cannot be completed in a short time, and the government continues to push forward efforts to reform the justice and police systems. The first steps have been taken, but there is still much work to be done. The government has started developing policies to support people who have faced racial discrimination, including strengthening the training of law enforcement officers on civil rights and issues related to fairness and the rights of all citizens. Authorities have realized that reforming the police force cannot be separated from transforming the entire justice system, and this requires sustained effort, not just through legal measures but also through changing the way law enforcement interacts with the public. A government official shared during a reform meeting, "We must go further, not just words, but action." This statement reflects the government's strong commitment to ensuring that reforms will not remain theoretical or just promises but will be implemented in practice. To implement these reforms, the government not only needs support from social organizations and the community, but also requires active participation from all sectors of society. Policies cannot remain merely declarations. They must be applied in practice to be effective. Therefore, the monitoring and enforcement of these reforms must be carried out rigorously and transparently. Social organizations and the community will continue to play a vital role in overseeing the implementation of these changes, ensuring that no one is left behind in the fight for justice. As these reforms are maintained and expanded, they will form a solid foundation for a just society where human rights are protected and justice is genuinely upheld for everyone. Angela returned to the place that had once bound both her body and her dignity. A tree hidden in a patch of open land, a silent witness to an unspeakable humiliation under the fading light of a murky sunset. The tree still stood, firm, but the marks of wire, the shouting voices, and the contemptuous stares had long faded. She did not return with resentment. Instead, she walked straight to the tree as if stepping into her own memory, placed her hand on its rough bark, closed her eyes, and took a deep breath. There were no tears, only a silence thick as a wall, before she spoke during a small community gathering. "I was humiliated here, but today I stand to prove I did not fall." All eyes turned to her, but Angela was not seeking pity. She sought a witness. Among hundreds, she stood at the center of a circle of memory, once brought down, now standing as a testament to change. Local police were present too, standing quietly on the sidelines, observing. Among the crowd that day, Tommy, the young officer who had once carried out the arrest with Matthews, quietly stepped onto the makeshift stage. After months of withdrawing from the force, he chose this moment to confront everything. His face no longer tense, his eyes heavy with something that could not be cleansed by mere apology. Holding the microphone, he stood for a long while, torn between silence and admission. Then he spoke. "I'm not proud of who I was that day, but I've learned this. Silence is also complicity. No one clapped, no one protested. They let the confession hang in the air like a slow breath." Tommy shared how he had been caught in a psychological system where obedience was taught as duty and suspicion of people with different skin was embedded in training. No, that was embedded in training. He said he once believed that standing still was the least harmful path, until that very stillness suffocated the human part of him. He left the force, not out of fear of public backlash, but to understand himself. Today he returned not to seek forgiveness, but to carry his share of the community's memory. Angela listened to every word. She did not nod, nor did she show forgiveness, but her silence no longer carried bitterness. It was an acknowledgement that a part of the past had been laid to rest. Those standing around, from mothers with children to people who once posted angry articles online, all witnessed two individuals who had once stood on opposite sides, now sharing a quiet moment of truth. That tree, once a symbol of bondage, had become a place where people tied white ribbons. Not to forget, but to remember that one day someone was humiliated here, and from that moment a community began to learn how to speak with its own wounds. In that moment no one said a word, but everyone understood that though history cannot be erased, how we remember it will shape what comes next. After weeks of courtroom proceedings under intense media and public scrutiny, Darren Matthews was finally forced to face the cameras, not as a police officer, but as a citizen bearing the marks of judgment and remorse. His face no longer held the familiar arrogance, replaced instead by a silence that could not hide the furrow etched deep between his brows. When reporters asked questions, Matthews still cited the phrase he once firmly believed in: public safety. But when the lights grew brighter and the badge was no longer there to lean on, he admitted in a low voice, "Maybe I thought I was right at the time, but now I know I was blinded by bias." The confession was neither a full admission of guilt nor an excuse. It was something in between, where truth and ego collide, forcing a man to acknowledge his role in the decay of a system he once served. Matthews did not return to the force, nor did he appear at community events. But his sentence did not end in the courtroom. It lingered in collective memory. A man once seen as a symbol of toughness had become a living example of what happens when the law is used to justify discrimination. News articles did not dwell on him, but every time Matthews's name was mentioned, it pulled the past back into focus, with the same haunting question: how can someone with power not know how to use it responsibly? Weeks later, in the same neighborhood where the incident took place, a memorial and tribute ceremony was held under the old tree, where Angela had once been tied and humiliated. There were no more chains, no more tension, no more suspicious stares. Only white ribbons hang quietly among the leaves, like strands of memory preserved to remind people that this place once held pain, but now marks the start of renewal. There were no chants, no large banners, just soft music, a few short speeches, and personal stories from the community. People didn't just honor Angela for her strength, but for opening a door that allowed everyone to face themselves. An older man who had once lived next to the abandoned house spoke as the crowd listened in silence. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means we choose not to let hatred lead the way. His words made many bow their heads, not in shame, but in emotion. They understood that forgiveness does not erase justice, but becomes justice matured, a form that transcends punishment to move toward healing. In that moment, many shook hands for the first time. Slow embraces between generations, between new police officers and longtime residents, between people who had once stood on opposite sides. The ceremony ended with the planting of a sapling beside the old tree. It was the idea of a group of students from the neighborhood. They didn't choose a large tree, but a small one, delicate yet resilient, just like the way this society has chosen to change, not with a bang, but with steady persistence. In the late afternoon light, the image of the new tree standing beside the old one, sunlight casting diagonally across faces once shadowed by anger, offered the perfect close to a long chapter. Not to bury the past, but to begin something more lasting, a community that knows how to confront its wounds, how to change, and how to move forward with kindness. At community centers, schools, and city halls, forums were being held more frequently. They weren't called lectures, but dialogues, where the past and present were laid side by side, and people from all walks of life came to listen, respond, and learn. At the heart of these forums was, of course, Angela's story, not as a victim, but as a milestone. The incident was not recalled to reopen wounds, but to examine each detail: the community's reaction, the system's silence, the media's awakening, and, most importantly, the brave refusal of one woman to be confined to the role of a victim. One speaker began a session with a steady voice. "We've learned that silence in the face of injustice is complicity. It's time to speak up and act." The applause that followed wasn't for flair, but because it struck a chord, a shared experience of once turning away from injustice and now understanding the cost of that silence. From these forums, a new generation is emerging, not through declarations, but through action. High school students who watched their parents protest, college students who saw the video of Angela tied up, are now leaving their classrooms with a sharper political and social awareness. Schools, instead of avoiding sensitive topics, have incorporated content on civil rights, the history of racial discrimination, and the role of dissent in a democracy into their core curriculum. These conversations have moved beyond classroom walls to the streets, where student groups host dialogues, stage performances, publish articles, and advocate for policy change. One student, speaking at a forum at Howard University, said, "We won't just study history, we'll be the ones who change it." That quote was repeated in countless articles because it captured what was happening. Change was no longer coming from a single intellectual elite, but from every walk of life, every voice willing to ask questions and step into the answers. The younger generation isn't just inheriting pain, they're inheriting responsibility. They're not standing outside the reform process, but directly proposing policies, questioning leaders, and building strong networks of dissent on digital platforms. But unlike movements that flare and fade, they are persistent and strategic, understanding that justice doesn't arrive overnight. It's built from daily demands, from small, deliberate actions. The changes already unfolding in the community are proof of that maturity, a kind of maturity that doesn't shy away from conflict, that embraces the discomfort of debate, and that never loses kindness in the midst of resistance. From the earliest forums, waves of students have joined community programs, supported those who were mistreated, advocated for legal reform, or, more simply, chosen to listen to those who had never been heard. Angela's story is not meant to be retold for its own sake, but to inspire each person to begin rewriting their own story, in their families, in their organizations, in schools, in courtrooms, and out on the streets. Justice, in the eyes of the new generation, is no longer a worn-out noun dulled by politics, but a concrete act, something that can be carried out right now, through each truth spoken aloud, each silence broken, and each heart that refuses to submit. And when that begins to live inside each person, justice stops being a distant goal and becomes the pulse of a society that is healing and being reborn. Justice, for the community that stood by Angela and witnessed her journey, is no longer the endpoint of a single path, but a living process, unfolding every day, everywhere, in every small decision and every interaction between people. Forums on the rule of law, the justice system, and how it operates continue to spread, But instead of focusing solely on punishment, more people are talking about how to build a society that can self-correct, respond, and learn from its failures. At an open dialogue in the neighborhood where Angela once lived, a community organizer stepped into the center of a circle of residents, holding a thick notebook, eyes bright as if gathering the entire spirit of a year-long fight. He spoke, not loudly, but clearly enough for all to hear. Justice is not a destination, it's a process. Every small step matters. Those plain, direct words stayed in people's minds as a new definition of what many had long believed to be an unchanging concept, because now, justice is no longer confined to courtrooms, no longer only visible in legal rulings, but present in the way an officer bows his head in respectful greeting to a resident, in how a child of color hears lessons about human dignity in their public school, and in how a community refuses to avoid the past and instead confronts it to shape the future. They understand that if every act of discrimination was born from the silence of the majority, then every act of repair must come from the engagement of each individual. Justice, then, is no longer something people receive from a system, but something they build in their everyday lives. Out of those stormy turns, something else took root with force. Solidarity. The community was no longer just a scattered group of people living in the same neighborhood, but a network of individuals who saw each other's pain and responded as if it were their own. They didn't have to agree on everything, but they refused to let indifference prevail. Neighborhood meetings were no longer just places to question the authorities, but spaces where people asked one another, "What will we do to make sure what happened to Angela never happens again?" Social groups, from churches and parent associations to art organizations, all joined forces in reform programs, some lending their voices, others their time, others their skills, all contributing to an unstoppable momentum. At a ceremony marking 1 year since Angela's video went viral, a small stage was set up in the city park. In that space, a community leader who had closely followed negotiations with the authorities on police reform stepped up to speak. There was no elaborate speech, just a few lines from the heart. Change only comes when all of us work together toward one goal: justice for all. That sentence needed no analysis because the presence of people of all races, ages, and faiths listening was proof enough. Angela was no longer in the daily media spotlight, but her spirit lived everywhere. In the hands of a mother holding her son as she walked him through a checkpoint, in the handshake between a street patrol officer and a homeless man, and in the petitions being signed to uphold reform. Justice was no longer only words on paper, but alive in every act of empathy. And that solidarity was the final piece, not to close the struggle, but to sustain it with a lasting conviction that no matter how deep the wound, a united community can always turn it into the starting point for what is right. The reforms promised in the early days of the incident, after a long and challenging journey, have finally begun to take shape in reality. Internal oversight policies in the police force are now reinforced by transparent, independent review processes. Every use of force must be reported, and every citizen complaint is taken seriously and no longer brushed aside as before. What once seemed like theoretical regulations are now present in every briefing, every training session, and even serve as criteria for promotion in police departments across the country. A new officer, fresh out of training, spoke at the swearing-in ceremony before the entire force. "I'm not just part of the system, I am a protector and a partner of the community." Those words rang out not as a slogan, but as a declaration of a new era, where responsibility and understanding are no longer optional but mandatory standards. At the same time, the community landscape is also changing. Neighborhoods that were once neglected are now receiving renewed investment, not just in funding, but in presence and care. Social organizations have begun expanding legal aid centers, counseling programs, and life skills education in areas once marked by conflict. People who used to feel afraid to walk outside now participate in community events, no longer feeling watched but heard. A civil rights representative, speaking at a citywide policy meeting, said with emotion, "We're not just fighting for justice, we're building a society where no one is left behind. That statement stood as a fitting summary of years of tireless effort, a long process, but one that never stopped moving forward. Inclusion does not come from pity, but from respect. Communities once discriminated against now have representatives on local councils, voices in public budget planning, and even members sitting on advisory panels for equity policy. This did not happen by chance, but through a long chain of advocacy, struggle, correction, and learning. Schools have begun teaching civic rights as a mandatory part of the curriculum, not shying away from painful historical truths, but helping the next generation grow up with awareness and courage. Public hospitals are training medical staff in cultural competency so that people of color no longer feel neglected in examination rooms. Neighborhood police are learning to approach residents not through force, but through dialogue and the building of trust. In a nationally broadcast interview, Angela Larkin, the woman once tied to a tree, now a public speaker and legal advisor for civil reform programs, sat at a round table with city leaders. Her eyes no longer carried sorrow, but held the strength of someone who had weathered the storm and chosen to stay and rebuild. She shared, "Justice doesn't come from revenge, but from reform. We've proven that what once seemed unchangeable can, in fact, be changed if we dare to face it and refuse to look away." The studio fell silent, not for lack of questions, but because everyone understood. This was no longer just her story, it was everyone's. And so, what seemed like the beginning of a tragedy, a black woman tied up in broad daylight by a white police officer, became the catalyst for a society to re-examine itself. The final strides forward weren't marked by fanfare, but by resilience, quietness, and certainty. In every new brick laid over old ground, in every handshake between former adversaries, in the ringing of school bells introducing lessons on human rights, equity, and accountability, a just society was no longer a distant ideal, but something gradually taking shape through the maturity of the people within it. Society doesn't change by law alone, but through the subtle shifts in each person's thinking. Since Angela's case, conversations haven't stayed confined to boardrooms or legislative halls, but have spilled onto the streets, into classrooms, family dinners, and corner cafes. People began to see each other differently, not through skin color or accent, but through how they lived and treated others. Stories once avoided came into the open, not for blame, but for recognition and repair. A social researcher, speaking at a public forum, summed it up clearly. "Changing the way we think is the key to building a more just society." That sentence became the headline printed on equity teaching handbooks, spreading through schools and community centers as a foundational message. This new way of thinking wasn't born from force, but was nurtured through a long journey of awareness, through Angela's public assault in broad daylight, through millions of views of the video capturing it, through thousands of peaceful protests, hundreds of proposed bills, and dozens of reforms passed. People began to understand that justice wasn't the sole duty of the state or the police, but both a responsibility and a right of every individual in society. A child taught that their friends, whether black or white, are equally valuable, will grow up free from any illusion of superiority. An adult who learns to listen will learn to adjust their behavior even in moments that seem harmless. And a society that chooses to look in the same direction will know that progress cannot exist without fairness and human dignity. Amid that wave of change, Angela was no longer just the woman who had once been tied to a tree by an abusive police officer. She had moved beyond the label of victim to become a living symbol of resilience. Her story was included in modern history textbooks, discussed at international conferences, portrayed in documentaries, and retold by mothers teaching their children that silence is never the answer. She didn't seek the spotlight from her pain, but the calmness with which she faced injustice helped millions see themselves in her journey. At the memorial held on the second anniversary of the incident, Angela stepped onto a small stage set in the park, a place once known as a protest hotspot. In the golden afternoon light, she wore a simple dress, her hair neatly tied, her voice steady and deep as if each word carried the weight of long, unrelenting years. "My story is not just mine," she said, her eyes eyes turned toward the quiet crowd. "It belongs to everyone who has fought and is still fighting for a just world. We will not stop until justice belongs to all." The applause didn't erupt immediately, but rose gradually, like a quiet wave swelling and spreading across the park. And then, as she stepped down, people came to shake her hand. Some brought their children to ask for a photo with her, not because she was famous, but because they wanted to remember the moment they witnessed a living witness of history. On social media, no one used the word victim to describe her anymore. They called her a pathfinder. Angela's life never returned to what it was, but she had never wished for that, because sometimes a wound doesn't leave a scar, but gives rise to a flower, reminding people that even from dead ground, new life can grow. Angela's legacy isn't in what she endured, but in how she turned it into meaning for others. It is the quiet but powerful transmission that happens when each person begins to ask themselves, "What can I do to contribute to this society?" And when that question becomes a shared thought, a society doesn't just pass through pain, it moves forward in a new form, where justice isn't a slogan, but the breath of everyday life. Beneath the old tree that once symbolized humiliation and abused power, there now stands a small plaque inscribed with the words, "The place where an awakening began." It was here that Angela had once been tied in broad daylight by a white police officer, Darren Matthews, who suspected her solely for her skin color and quiet composure. That act of violence, which might have been buried like countless others, unintentionally sparked an unprecedented wave of outrage. The video, captured by a passerby, spread rapidly, igniting a series of protests, public dialogues, and sweeping changes across the country. Angela, once an unknown woman, became a symbol of justice, the image of defiance, of someone who responded not with hatred, but with the power of resilience and unshakable belief. The journey that followed was far from easy. Matthews was investigated and convicted. More importantly, society began to reflect on itself. Community organizations, social activists, and even politicians started engaging in deeper conversations about the system, about power and accountability. Tommy, the young officer who was present at the scene and had once remained silent in the face of wrongdoing, also stepped forward to admit his mistake and chose a path of change. This was not just about one individual's misconduct, but about a system that needed fundamental reform. Police reforms were implemented, training programs were rewritten, and internal oversight became more transparent. Workshops, public education campaigns, and justice advocacy movements took place continuously. Conversations about justice and equality were no longer peripheral topics, but became central to public life. Angela did not choose to turn away. She appeared at panel discussions, policy forums, and educational programs, with a voice that never had to be loud to be heard. She spoke about surviving fear without letting it define her. She spoke about being hurt without letting hatred shape the future. She told her story like someone laying the first brick to rebuild a fractured foundation of justice. She became a symbol of hope, not because she won a lawsuit, but because she reminded people that even when pushed to the brink, one can choose to resist with dignity. From an act of brutality, society was forced to confront its mindset and recognize that justice cannot be only the outcome of a verdict, but a continuous process sustained through education, media, and personal commitment. That journey was not fast or complete, but it had begun. People learned to speak up, the younger generation learned to challenge, and institutions of power learned to listen. What was once hidden in the shadows was named, and what was once dismissed was now placed on the scale to be reckoned with from the root. Angela's story is a reminder that when injustice is exposed, it can change society if people are brave enough to face it head-on. It proves that any individual, no matter how dismissed, has the power to shift the course of history if they hold on to their values. It is a lesson that crosses borders, skin color, and titles. That justice cannot be merely the aim of laws, but must be the living commitment of an entire community. That silence in the face of injustice is itself a form of complicity, and that the most dangerous thing is not the wrongdoing itself, but the normalization of it in people's minds. Angela didn't chant slogans, didn't seek the spotlight. She just stood there, one step at a time, like a living marker, reminding us that sometimes social change doesn't begin with sweeping laws, but with the moment one person dares to stand still in the face of violence and say, "I will not fall."